Okay, so now that we've looked at the English Revolution, we're going to look at the perhaps more famous revolution in the American Revolution, which starts officially in 1776, although as I'll explain a little bit, it doesn't just happen with the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is what emerges out of this move toward independence and move toward revolution, dissatisfaction with Britain that had been brewing since about the mid 18th century. And I'll talk a little bit more about why specifically that is. The American Revolution is probably, at least in North America, one of the more famous ones, largely because it's hard to avoid it with our southern neighbors talking about it all the time. And of course, last week was just the 4th of July. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of a background to the American Revolution, the lead up, why the Americans are so upset with the English monarchy and English Parliament and England in general, the balance of class forces that lead to the revolution, and what the revolution doesn't do, the sort of radical ideas that emerge out of it, some of which are stamped out and, just like in the English case, never really fully go away. So, as I said earlier, the American Revolution is interesting in the sense that it is both a revolution and a colonial war of independence. And this always caused confusion amongst historians. There were historians who, not so much anymore, but used to argue that, well, was it even really a revolution? Like, it's more of a war of independence rather than an actual revolution proper, right? Was there really a lot of social change? It's not like the French Revolution, which we'll look at in a minute, where it's, this kind of tearing society apart. There was a common enemy in the British, which created in some ways more unification in the colonies. But it is safe to say that it was also a revolution. It is a colonial war of independence, and it is absolutely also a revolution. There's a lot of change that happens, and it's not just about overthrowing the monarchy. It's the idea of received authority is changed in the United States, which is why to this day the Americans maintain that sense of, who are you to tell me what to do, kind of thing. Right? And a lot of that emerges organically out of the revolution, or people thinking they're still fighting the revolution, as you're still seeing to this day. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the Patriot Coalition. As I said earlier, the Patriot Coalition is really, again, if we look at the theme of these bourgeois liberal capitalist revolutions, it's property owners that are leading it. And in the case of the Americans, it's these urban merchants and southern planters, right, southern slave owners. And of course, just like in the English Revolution, there is a radical undercurrent. There's an urban crowd in the northern cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and a kind of backcountry farmers that want to kind of exist independent of the market in that sense, want to kind of a more subsistence lifestyle. Okay, so let's look at the lead up to the American Revolution. So if we look at what was happening in England, right, you're talking the late 17th century, late 1600s. At that point, the American colonies were sort of firmly on their way to being this offshoot of British society, this colonial British society. The first settlement, English settlement in the Americas, is 1607. The first slaves come to America, or at least what becomes the United States. They were in the Spanish, Caribbean, and British Caribbean long before that, but in the 1620s. And basically what happens is in the 17th century, colonial society develops, not independent from Britain, but develops with not a lot of interference from Britain. And what you get in the South is the emergence of a plantation society, plantation slavery. What starts as a society with slaves by the 1700 becomes a slave society. And the difference, of course, just like when we talked about the difference between a society with markets and a market society, is that in a slave society, the entire economic and social base is dependent on slavery. In a society with slaves, it's a society where you have a lot of things that exist independently of slavery, that it's there, but once we get to the early 18th century, the American South, especially Virginia, that sort of Chesapeake society, which is where Virginia and Maryland are today, is really a slave society, that its entire economic and social foundation is built on slavery. And these large planters dominate Southern society, owning hundreds of slaves. You also have a kind of yeoman backcountry farming class in the South. In the North, we see the emergence in cities like Philadelphia and Boston, but especially New York, as a kind of emerging robust commercial society underpinned by a wealthy merchant class. Merchants that a century later would become, these early nascent industrial capitalists of Lynn, Massachusetts, the shoemakers or the textile manufacturers that will eventually spread all over the United States. So this is kind of the society that is emerging in colonial America. So a lot of what changes happens in the mid-18th century. So after Britain comes out of or after England rather, comes out of this revolution in the 1600s, you get a kind of acceleration of capitalist development in England, an acceleration of British imperial expansion. And in the mid-18th century, in 1756, you get war between the English and the French. And this war will become thereafter known as the 7 Years' War, right? For obvious reasons, it lasts 7 years. It starts in 1756 and ends in 1763. Now, in many ways, this war could quite properly be characterized as the first truly global conflict, right? In many ways, some historians refer to it as the First World War, right? Even though the First World War is 1914 to 1918. If we define a war as existing all over the globe, well, then the 7 Years' War certainly meets that criteria. It didn't involve every country and every nation in the world, but Britain and France fought in Europe, they fought in North America, they fought in the Caribbean, they fought in South America, they fought in the Pacific, and they fought in India. So the British and the French, these sort of emerging colossal imperial powers, were fighting all over the world. And in that sense, it was probably the largest conflict in world history up until that point, only to be superseded by the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, and then, of course, eventually the World Wars of the 20th century. So as a result of, as I said, for the most part, the American colonies developed on their own with little interference from the Crown in England. But in the 1750s, when England and France go to war, this changes. Now, without getting into specifics about the war, Britain emerges victorious. Britain decisively defeats the French. And there's sort of two consequences that emerge out of this war. First, French power in North America and the Americas in general is virtually destroyed. The French had controlled what, of course, is Quebec, and what also is referred to as the Louisiana Territory. Now, the Louisiana Territory is basically, if you look at where the Mississippi River is in the United States, right, where New Orleans is, that whole area in between the Rocky Mountains and the eastern United States, that was all controlled by the French and then sort of linked up with Quebec. After the 7 Years' War and the British victory, all that land is ceded to Britain. The only part of land that the French actually maintain is, of course, Saint-Domingue. Later Haiti, right? And you'll understand why that island becomes so important to the French. It is the richest colony in the world. It produces more sugar than any other colony in the world. The French were never as imperially minded or expansionist as the British were, but Saint-Domingue was kind of the crown jewel of the French Empire, and it was, in some ways, it was the one thing the French got to keep. In fact, the British offered them a choice between Quebec and Saint-Domingue, and they chose Saint-Domingue, not Quebec, because it was far more valuable. So this is key. French power in North America is destroyed. The English are now the preeminent power in North America. North America is almost entirely, at least in the eastern part, under some form of British rule. Now, the second consequence is that Britain spent a lot of money defeating the French and were heavily in debt and needed to raise even more revenue. And guess where they turned? From Britain's perspective, the colonies should help shoulder the financial burden of paying for the war. So they start levying taxes against the colonists. And they also had to station more troops in the colony as a result to defend all this new territory. And I'm not going to get into every single act of parliament that the American revolutionaries don't like. I'll just look at one or two. But the key thing they do first is pass what's called the Stamp Act, almost immediately after. I think it's 1765, right? So 2 years after the war. And essentially what this means is, when you think of stamps, you think of stamps to mail on a letter, but it's actually far more expansive than that. It was any paper used to print anything in the colony. So if you used paper to print your newspaper, to make legal documents, to print a magazine, to make playing cards, it had to be paper produced in London that had a stamp that proved it was produced in London. So even though it's called the Stamp Act, basically what they're doing is taxing all paper, the use of paper in the American colonies, right? So any paper that was used had to be bought from manufacturers in London, not in the colonies. Now, this upset the colonists for a number of reasons. They didn't like being told what to do. They didn't like tax in general, because as they thought, they had already paid their fair share in blood in fighting the French. But what they also felt was that their rights of Englishmen were being violated because they had no representation in Parliament. From their logic, from the American colonist logic, if Parliament wanted to tax them, well, then they needed to elect representatives to go sit in the English Parliament. Right? If we go back to the English Civil War, so much of what the English Revolution was about was, the right to taxation, right? Parliament's ability to secure property. Well, you had all these property owners in the American colonies who were saying, wait a minute, you can't tax me unless I have representation in Parliament. Right? Hence the slogan, no taxation without representation. Now, Parliament contended that they had virtual representation, just like a lot of people in Britain who were not represented by Parliament. Remember, Parliament only represented the property classes. So Britain said, well, yeah, you don't actually have members that sit in Parliament, but we think of your interests. So you're virtually represented, just like a lot of people in England who don't have formal representation in Parliament. But of course, these were not just normal people in that context, right? These people were wealthy landowners. They were wealthy merchants. People like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson owned hundreds of slaves and were in some ways the richest men in the Americas. But it wasn't just plantation slave owners. There was an urban merchant class, people like Benjamin Franklin. People like Paul Revere, who was a silversmith, also detested the taxation of the American colonies without formal representation in Parliament. Now, there was a few other things that they did. One thing in particular was they passed a law called the Quebec Act, which actually limited their ability to migrate west. So they didn't like the Parliament in London telling American settlers where they could and couldn't go in what they viewed as their own country. Part of the reason Britain did this was because they had treaty rights with indigenous peoples that were west of the Appalachians, as well as French settlers who, under the treaty with the French, the British agreed to look out for their rights as well as now new subjects of the British Empire. And there were more taxes. But another key issue was trade. Remember that triangle of trade we talked about when we looked at plantation slavery, right? That system wasn't voluntary. And if you remember the way the triangle of trade worked, right, you had labor, which the British were just stealing, kidnapping people against their will in Africa, West Africa. Slaves moving across the Middle Passage to the Americas, right? Raw materials like cotton eventually, but tobacco, rice, indigo was produced in the colonies with slave labor and shipped to London. And then manufactured goods were made in England, right? And sold to the American colonists. The American colonies were a large market for manufactured goods in England, right? Now, that triangle of trade was not something that just emerged organically, right? I mean, it kind of did, but Britain was an empire. So if you were a merchant or a southern planter, you couldn't sell your tobacco or trade whatever it is you were trading as a merchant in New York, Philadelphia, or Boston with anybody you pleased. You could sell it in your own market, but you also had to export these things back to London. If you wanted to, say, sell tobacco to the French or other colonies in the Americas, in Spanish America, or French colonies in the Caribbean, or British colonies in the Caribbean, you couldn't do that, right? So they wanted to be able to trade with whoever they wanted to. They wanted to seek out new markets in Europe and elsewhere without Britain having to tell them whether they could or couldn't. Now, by the mid-1770s, things get a lot worse. In 1770, if we look here, British troops, actually, it's called the Boston Massacre, fired on a mob and killed several people while protesting. In fact, this slide is actually accurate. I think the first person actually killed by the British was an African-American free person in Boston at the time, who, of course, as we'll see by the end of the American Revolution, slavery is actually reinforced by the end of the American Revolution. And in 1774, in the protest of monopoly on the sale of the price of tea, basically the British would only allow the East India Company to sell tea and regulate the price in the colonies. The colonists in Boston, in this famous incident known as the Boston Tea Party, snuck on to an East India Company ship and threw all the tea in the harbor. And then after a series of what were referred to as the Intolerable Acts that were fairly draconian in the British's ability to arrest and imprison potential agitators, this leads in 1776 to the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. And we can imagine the revolution in the words of Thomas Jefferson. When we think of the Declaration of Independence, and this is where we get to this balance of class forces, all men are created equal, right? It's the idea of republican government, that they're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And like in the English case, once these ideas get out there, they're hard to contain, right? Getting rid of the monarchy, getting rid of the nobility. Okay, well, now that we're getting rid of things and we're getting rid of privileges, right? Well, let's talk about real equality. A lot of sort of lower class colonists were actually starting to think about. And they may not have read the Declaration of Independence, but in 1775, 1776, a man named Thomas Paine, who actually was an Englishman, wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And it essentially articulated these ideas of the Enlightenment, these Lockean, Hobbesian ideas of of equality, of political rights, of liberty. All of these things were put into the language of the common people, right? Locke, for those of you that have actually read him, it's pretty dry, it's very high-minded philosophy. What Thomas Paine did was he took these ideas and he printed them in a pamphlet. And it was the best-selling pamphlet, and still is, I think, the best-selling pamphlet in the history of the United States. I mean, certainly in terms of percentage. There were about 2.5 million people that lived in the American colonies at this point. Well over 1 million of them either would have read or heard somebody read it. If you couldn't read, you probably went to a reading of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So these ideas spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the landed elite and these sort of men of education who could read these things, right? Thomas Paine's Common Sense was read by everybody, and it was in many ways a little bit more radical than the things that Thomas Jefferson was actually proposing. And this sort of lower sort tried to push the revolution in more radical directions. Now, the revolution takes place from 1776 to 1783. In 1783, the Americans emerge victorious, and Britain recognizes the United States, and they set up a Republican constitutional government, which I'll talk about in a minute. But these radical undercurrents persisted, just like in England. In fact, historian Carl Becker once said, once home rule was decided, the question became who shall rule at home. So there was an urban crowd. And indeed, in Pennsylvania, for example, there was an urban crowd that actually wanted to abolish slavery, and did in Pennsylvania, and institute universal male suffrage. And they actually formed a militia to defend these ideas. And in fact, it was one of the first things that Washington actually had to put down as leader of the Continental Army. He was fighting the British, but he had to put down a rebellion of a much more radical army that emerged in Pennsylvania that wanted to abolish slavery, wanted universal male suffrage. A lot of these elites like Washington and Jefferson, they believed in a republican government, that is, in a government where you elect people to make decisions. They weren't necessarily full believers in what we would determine as full-blown democracy. They felt that people needed property qualifications to vote. Right? If you had to vote, you had to own property. You had to have a stake in the nation. So they rejected the idea, at least initially, of universal suffrage. Right? These urban merchants and southern planters really were about protecting their property, and they thought only people that had acquired property had earned the right to vote. And if we go back to that Stamp Act crisis that we talked about in Boston in the 1760s, at one point, the urban mob, just to show you how radical it could be, actually sacked the house of the British Stamp Act official. I think his name was Andrew Oliver. So there was this radical undercurrent that could have pushed the revolution in a much more radical direction. And then, of course, there were these backcountry farmers who supported the revolution, but again, they weren't so much radical as they wanted to be left alone. And right after the American independence in 1783, right, what they're trying to resist is the expansion of the market in commercial agriculture. They don't want to be commercial agriculturalists. They want to exist in a kind of subsistence lifestyle, live independently of the market and kind of everybody else. But markets expand, as those of you that have been studying them understand, and eventually the market and the commodification of land moved into their area. Also, many of these farmers fell into debt, and they actually rebelled. And this was one of the key things that created the need for a stronger constitution, which becomes the federal constitution that the United States has to this day. After the revolution in 1783, you had essentially a United States that was governed under something called the Articles of Confederation, which had a very weak central government that couldn't actually raise taxes. In fact, if it wanted money, it had to ask the states for money, and the states could refuse. And as a result of this rebellion, the federal government was actually incapable of putting it down, something referred to as Shays' Rebellion. In the end, it was a consortium of private bankers that financed a private army to put it down. And this made the government realize that they needed a much stronger central government. And so in 1789, the American Constitution was ratified. And George Washington becomes the first president in 1790. But these radical ideas persisted, right? Property qualifications would remain in terms of whether or not you could vote, but by the 1830s, under President Andrew Jackson, you basically got universal white male suffrage. Of course, the other issue with the American Revolution was the fate of slavery. And we'll look at that more in a minute. These are sort of just things that sum up what happened with the American Revolution. But if we look at slavery, the American Revolution actually strengthened the political power of slavery. The question of slavery was not really dealt with during the Revolution. There were people that actually opposed slavery, so people who say, these were men of their time. No, there were people that opposed slavery in the 1780s and the 1790s. And part of the reason was because they felt that slavery was actually on its way out. They felt that plantation slavery had kind of run its course, that eventually slavery would just kind of peter out. This doesn't happen because they don't anticipate cotton, which becomes the staple crop of the 19th century and reinvigorates slavery in the 18-teens and 1820s. But the only mention of slavery in the American Constitution is two things. One, ending the ban on the slave trade in 1808, which was actually at the insistence of the South, because the South felt that it was easier to keep people in bondage if they were born into it. If you imported people from Africa who were born free and then became slaves, they were more likely to rebel, which is probably true. The only other mention is something that's referred to as the 3/5 clause. Now, the reason this exists in the Constitution is because the Southerners, when they were debating the Constitution, said, well, if we're determining how many seats we get in the House of Representatives, we want to count our slaves. And the North said, well, you can't do that, because then you'll have double the amount of population. And the South said, well, it's either that or we're not joining. So they reached a compromise in which they counted slaves, but they counted them as only 3/5 of a human being. So in the American Constitution, written into it from the beginning, it says that slaves, or more broadly, African Americans, are worth 3/5 of a white person. That's in the American Constitution. And as a result of this, slavery is firmly entrenched in the United States. Even though they think it's on the way out, it doesn't. It gets reinvigorated by the rise of cotton in the 19th century. And these slave-owning aristocrats, who are these plantation owners, become some of the most powerful people in the United States. And their ability to control, at least from the North's perspective, the levers of federal power will eventually lead to the Civil War of the 1860s, which is the final nail in the coffin of slavery in the United States. So to sum up, the American Revolution leads to the independence of the American colonies. They are free now from imperial trade restrictions and regulations, right? Private property has been sanctified. It is something that is going to be protected. You get a Republican government, and it has strengthened the political power of slavery and the men who own slaves. All right, so that's the American Revolution. Next, we will look at the French Revolution, which, as you'll see, emerges in many ways out of the American Revolution, largely because the French give the United States a lot of money and a lot of weapons, and after the end of the American Revolution, the French government is heavily in debt, just like Britain was after the 7 Years' War.